Now, with Henry, I tried to come up with what situation perfectly encapsulates him, but I think it's much harder. You have things like the Merciless Parliament. You have so many different times where he's a quasi-crusader. I don't know if we can fully call him a crusader. It depends on how you define it. His jousting, his martial skills, that there's so many different options that you can kind of pull from. Is there one that you can think of where you say, like, when you want to see the real Henry, all that he can do, this is who he is?
Actually, the thing that comes to my mind, because as you say, his public career is so varied because, of course, he's doing the work. He's doing what initially a great nobleman is supposed to do, and then he ends up taking the throne and is trying very hard to do what a king is supposed to do. And that encapsulates so many different forms of work, forms of responsibility, forms of the exercise of power. But the thing that strikes me so hard about Henry, of all the people I've ever studied, and Dan has sometimes accused me of getting a bit too close to my subject here, but people like Henry. And even though we don't have diaries and memoirs and letters and so on, it's palpable in the sources that you read that he makes friends and he keeps friends. And the one person who doesn't like Henry is Richard. That may tell its own story. But so the story that I'm reaching for to tell you something about Henry the man is that when he's on these European travels, as you say, he goes crusading in Prussia and Lithuania against the pagans of Lithuania with the Teutonic Knights. He then goes as a pilgrim to Jerusalem. He passes through many of the great courts of continental Europe, including the Duchy of Milan. And he meets a young noblewoman there, she's in her teens at this point, called Lucia Visconti. And Lucia Visconti says a few years later, when she's being asked to agree to marry someone else, a German princeling, she says, and this is in the state papers of the Duchy of Milan, she says if she could have been sure of marrying Henry, she would have waited to the very end of her life, even if she knew she was going to die 3 days after the wedding. That's how much of an impression Henry had made on her. Now, you might think that's a teenage girl being blown away by a glamorous golden boy breezing through the court, and it probably was that. But when Henry became king, Lucia got out of this marriage that she was supposed to make to the German princeling. She got that annulled in the end. Henry was already married to someone else. So that marriage that she dreamed of couldn't happen. But she was left a bit adrift. She was one of many, many sisters. Nothing was being fixed for her. And Henry remembered her. And Henry knew that there was a very dashing young nobleman at the English court, Edmund, Earl of Kent, who didn't have much money because there were 3 widowed dowager countesses in his family who had most of his estates. But Edmund was a jouster, he was a fighter, he was a glamorous young knight, and Lucia potentially had a pretty big dowry coming from Milan. And Henry sent a personal messenger over to Milan to make arrangements with her cousin the Duke for this marriage, and brought Lucia to England and gave her away at her wedding in what was clearly the Hello magazine glamour wedding of the season. It's in every single chronicle that you can read in England that the Earl of Kent married the Duke of Milan's cousin and how beautiful she was. And this was, I mean, when I was going through the edit with my editor, who's also a brilliant historian, he said, look, Helen, you've got to explain the political context to this. You've got to explain what was going on between England and Milan that made this a diplomatic marriage. And I looked and I looked and I looked and I looked and I said, I'm so sorry. It isn't. This is a personal gesture on Henry's part to rescue a young woman that he remembers from his travels, who he knows had hoped to marry him. And he's fixing her up with the best marriage he can. It doesn't quite work because Edmund, Earl of Kent, then gets killed in a military campaign in an island off the coast of Brittany very soon after the wedding. But Henry always remembers Lucia and looks out for her and tries to make sure she's okay. And that, to me, gives something of the measure of the man, that there's something intensely human about Henry, even in this age where it's hard to see the human being. And that's one of the reasons I think people loved him. It may also have been one of the reasons that he wasn't quite, unlike his son who became Henry V, quite hard enough as a character to construct the persona of kingship that allows a really, really successful king to have the whip hand in his kingdom. Maybe that was one of the problems. He had a lot of other problems at the same time, but I have a real soft spot for Henry, and I think it's because other people around him liked him and loved him.